The views expressed on the Nova Society are those of the panelists and guests and do not necessarily reflect the views or opinions of the Phoenix Research Institute or any institution which any panel member is associated. Reproduction or dissemination other than for the purpose of education or information without the express written permission of the Phoenix Research Institute or Nova Society Media is strictly prohibited. Today, the Nova Society begins a 5-part series with our special guest, Glenn Kirschner. Glenn is a former federal prosecutor and served in the U.S. Attorney's Office for the District of Columbia for 24 years. Prior to joining the D.C. U.S. Attorney's Office, Glenn served more than 6 years on active duty as an Army Judge Advocate General Prosecutor. Glenn spent 6.5 years as an on-air legal analyst and columnist for NBC News and MSNBC, and has a great podcast that we suggest all of our listeners check out, Justice Matters with Glenn Kirschner. So, without further ado, let's listen in.
So, I'd like to welcome everyone back to the Nova Society. I'm your host, Dr. Brooklyn Ann Weldon, and today we are joined by Glenn Kirschner, who is a former federal prosecutor with 30 years of trial experience. Glenn served in the U.S. Attorney's Office for the District of Columbia for 24 years, rising to the position of Chief of the Homicide Section. In that capacity, Glenn supervised 30 homicide prosecutors and oversaw all homicide grand jury investigations and prosecutions in Washington, D.C. Prior to joining the D.C. U.S. Attorney's Office, Glenn served more than 6 years on active duty as an Army Judge Advocate General, or JAG, prosecutor, trying court-martial cases and handling criminal appeals, including espionage and death penalty cases. Glenn spent 6.5 years as an on-air legal analyst and columnist for NBC News and MSNBC, but left corporate media in early 2025, choosing to be all independent in his legal analysis work. Glenn has a YouTube channel and podcast, Justice Matters with Glenn Kirschner, dedicated to analyzing the legal issues of the day. He taught a criminal law course, Anatomy of a Homicide, for 4 years at George Washington University Law School, and he taught undergraduate criminal justice at GWU for 5 years. Glenn tried hundreds of cases in his 30 years as a prosecutor, including more than 50 murder trials, multiple lengthy RICO trials, and precedent-setting cases. His cases have been made into major motion pictures. Murder conviction of a sophisticated con man who ran in elite D.C. circles, subject of Georgetown, a film starring Vanessa Redgrave, Christoph Waltz, and Annette Bening, and TV documentaries, including the multi-part documentary Who Killed Robert Wone. Glenn attended Washington and Lee University in Lexington, Virginia, and was first-team All-American football player in 1983. In 1987, he graduated with honors from New England School of Law in Boston, where he was named a Trustees Scholar. Glenn has received numerous awards, including the Harold J. Sullivan Award for Fairness, Ethics, and Trial Excellence, the John F. Evans Award for Outstanding Advocacy, the Metropolitan Police Department's Chief of Police Medal of Honor, the United States Attorney's Office Star Award, U.S. Army Meritorious Service Medal, Washington and Lee University Athletic Hall of Fame inductee, and induction in September 2018 into the American College of Trial Lawyers. Welcome, Glenn.
Well, our hour is up.
Thank you. Thank you for everybody enduring that lengthy bio.
All right. So I have one question, though. What position did you play?
Line to the goal line. I was a center. I banged heads with a nose guard or a linebacker for 60 minutes, and I loved being part of the team. My two guards, my two tackles. That's kind of where my heart still is, out on the football field.
Oh, good.
And welcome also to our regular panel, Dr. Mark Bound and Dr. Scott Kirschner.
Those other guys.
Yeah, those other guys. Yes, those other guys. So, Glenn, as I wrote in my email to you, I have a lengthy list of questions. Mark, Scott, what do you have? Where would you like to start?
Well, I haven't looked at the news for like 15 minutes, so I don't know what's going on. Um, but I thought a good enough place to start would be with the resignation of Denise Chung, the head of the criminal division in DC U.S. Attorney's Office, which I think is your old stomping grounds. Basically, as I read this, she was asked to put a freeze on funds and was pressured to launch a criminal probe where there was no evidence of any kind of criminal activity. And it reminded me a lot of what Trump said to a former would-be U.S. attorney or acting U.S. attorney, just say the election was fraudulent and leave the rest to me and the Republicans in Congress. That's kind of where we're back to now, where justice is a totally political game.
Yeah, I've known Denise for decades. She was a homicide prosecutor back in the day when we were trying murder cases. She's been with the Department of Justice in many capacities for the last 24 years. She is honest, ethical, honorable, no nonsense, and she will not play the games of corrupt leadership. And I say that with no glee or pleasure. It seems like the folks that Donald Trump has installed into the upper echelons of the Department of Justice are acting corruptly. We're going to learn more about that today at 2:00 in a Manhattan courtroom when Eric Adams' case will be up because the leadership of the Department of Justice tried to dismiss his public corruption prosecution, which is a really significant criminal prosecution of the mayor of New York, and they did it for political reasons. They said expressly, this is Emile Beauvais, who is the acting deputy attorney general at the minute, expressly has nothing to do with the evidence, with the facts, with the law. We want the mayor to help Donald Trump in his political priorities, like on the immigration front. That is actually a little thing we call bribery, using your official position as a prosecutor for a thing of personal value or value to your boss. So I can't wait to hear how Judge Dale Ho conducts the hearing today. But he basically said, and I'm going to summarize here, I have his court order in front of me, y'all got some splaining to do because this cannot go unchecked. And so getting back to Denise Chung, sorry, I got sidetracked. That's the news that's coming up in, just a few minutes. Denise felt compelled to resign. And in fact, the acting U.S. attorney, Ed Martin, a stop the steal guy who has come in and just wrought havoc on the U.S. Attorney's Office for the District of Columbia, and by extension, the people of the District of Columbia, told her to do something she believed was absolutely unethical. Seize funds or issue an order to banks seizing and freezing funds. You actually need probable cause under the Fourth Amendment in order to begin seizing the property and assets of another. And there was no hint of probable cause in the evidence that she assessed, according to her resignation letter. And the U.S. attorney said, I don't care, do it anyway. And if you don't, I want your resignation. This is the way the Trump administration is comporting itself. And to say it is dangerous to the health of the rule of law is an understatement. They're trying to snuff out the rule of law is what it feels like to this former 30-year federal prosecutor. And I am heartened that the good men and women of the Department of Justice are standing up to it, and they are offering to resign. And let me just say, a lot of people are like, they're obeying in advance. Why shouldn't they wait until they get fired? And I say, these are difficult decisions that each person has to make for him or herself. You can stand up in a principled way and then offer a righteous resignation, or you can stand up in a principled way and immediately be unlawfully terminated and then spend the next year or two in court fighting the unlawful termination. I do not tell people one is better than the other, or you have to do one and you shouldn't do the other. These are intensely personal decisions. And when they offered principled resignations rather than doing something that is unlawful or unethical, I think that also speaks volumes of their honor, their integrity, and their dedication to their oath of office to support and defend the Constitution, not support and defend a corrupt administration.
So let me ask you this. I mean, it's in the news today that Trump is reminding the Supreme Court that they gave him immunity. And this came up on one of our previous podcasts. And Brooklyn was asking, could they possibly revisit that decision? And my comment was, yeah, you go back in, you go back to the drawing board, you offer a new argument, and we see where this goes to. So if the Justice Department is working under Trump and they're working under his direction, would that be a way, if he's doing things that's definitely unconstitutional, would that be a way for them to reopen this argument of immunity, in your opinion?
Thank you, both Brooklyn and Mark, for raising that issue, because I have been screaming about it in recent days. I have not just a dream, but a fever dream. People will accuse me of inhaling too much opium at times, but here is my fever dream, that the Supreme Court, the 5 justices who granted Donald Trump the power of lawlessness, which is as dangerous and dictatorial as it gets, will realize the Frankenstein monster of a president they've created. And what we saw Donald Trump do in his first week in office was sign a series of unlawful and unconstitutional executive orders. So much so that a federal judge who was appointed by Ronald Reagan, who has been on the bench for more than 40 years, within the first few days of the Trump administration, had to address the constitutionality of Donald Trump trying to revoke the constitutional guarantee of birthright citizenship. And that judge said, and I quote, "It's blatantly unconstitutional. And where were the lawyers when Donald Trump was signing this?" Well, they knew it was unconstitutional. And they signed it intentionally so they could bubble it all the way up to Donald Trump's, air quotes, Supreme Court, in hopes that the Supreme Court would continue rewriting the Constitution, as they have been doing, both on the 14th Amendment disqualification of insurrectionist front and on the presidential immunity front, because the presidential immunity ruling is contrary to the Constitution in 2 places. And I choose to rely on the assessment of one of our preeminent constitutional scholars, Yale law professor Akil Reed Amar, who said that what they did in the presidential immunity ruling was they ruled that the Constitution is unconstitutional. That's an abuse of judicial power. The problem is when the Supreme Court justices are the ones abusing judicial power, there's no other court of appeal. And so we're stuck. But I love your question, and thank you for indulging me my long-winded run-up to answering it. They absolutely, in my opinion, can take any number of these unconstitutional acts by Donald Trump, birthright citizenship, freezing all government funds to the states that have already been allocated by Congress, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And they can use it as a vehicle to say, we have created a Frankenstein monster of a president when we bestowed upon all presidents the power of lawlessness. And we are now revisiting it, what we call sua sponte, on our own. So, and yes, they can direct more briefs to be filed. They can order supplemental arguments on that precise issue. But you bet they can revisit it. But will they revisit it? And that's where it's my fever dream that they will. But I think if they care at all, the Supreme Court justices, about not just the health of our democracy, but the viability of our democracy, they will. Because just as you mentioned, Donald Trump can do all this lawless stuff. He can order his military or his DOJ officials to do all kinds of lawless stuff. And he can't be prosecuted because directing your military folks and your DOJ officials are what they call core constitutional functions for which he has absolute immunity. And then he can go one step further. Anybody in the military or the DOJ who followed his unlawful directives, he can pardon them using his other core constitutional function, the pardon power, and everyone gets away with crime. And that is why Justice Sotomayor, joined by 2 other justices, said, with fear for our democracy, dissent. Gosh, I hope the Supreme Court revisits its horrifically ill-advised and unconstitutional presidential immunity ruling.
Okay, so if they do it, is it, what did you say? Sua
sponte. That's a fancy lawyer term so we can charge people when we run our mouths. Sua sponte is just on their own.
Thank you. Sua sponte. Thank you. I like saying things correctly and getting the terms correct. Sua sponte. Okay, so then no one has to bring a suit, because I wondered who would be the individuals to bring that, so they don't have to. Okay, so if the Supreme Court chooses to go ahead and do this themselves, and then Trump with his "he who saves his country never violates the law" and blah blah says, "I'm not going to listen," encouraged by Musk and Vance and all this, then what happens?
Yeah, what a great question. Then our country is plunged into a true constitutional crisis. We use the term constitutional crisis all the time. And the reality is, practically speaking, every minute Donald Trump is in power, it feels like our Constitution is in crisis. But that's not what a constitutional crisis is. I think the most accurate definition is when you have two co-equal branches of government, and one has the authority to make a decision and the other needs to recognize and be bound by that decision. But that other co-equal branch of government says, we don't care if the Supreme Court said it's unconstitutional. We are doing it anyway. That is when co-equal branches of government collide. That's a constitutional crisis for which there is no remedy. And the Supreme Court has said over time, Supreme Court justices have commented, I'm kind of surprised that the executive branch follows our rulings about what they can and can't do, because we don't have an army to enforce them. It is always through the good graces and the honor of the men and women who populate the federal government, the executive branch, to abide by Supreme Court rulings, because that is our constitutional construct. Trump doesn't have the time of day for the Constitution or any of the restrictions it puts on the president or on the executive branch. So now, Brooklyn, you're seeing the pattern where I have to do a long run up to answer your question. Here is what happens, in my opinion. And I interviewed a retired assistant director from the United States Marshal Service yesterday about this very thing. The U.S. Marshal Service is responsible for enforcing federal court orders. So the federal courts could order that. I don't want this to sound hyperbolic, right? But they could order, I'm not going to use Trump, a Trump administration official, a cabinet member, they could order them to be detained because there has been a finding that they are in contempt of federal court orders. The United States Marshals, I never leave home without my big, ugly blue book of federal laws, the United States Code. And I have my printout somewhere ahead of, okay, I can't find it. Anyway, I think I can remember it for those who might be scoring at home. It's 28 United States Code, section 566B or C, I think it's B. And it says, the United States Marshals shall, that's an important word in federal law, shall execute federal court orders, period. They are the ones who are not only empowered to execute contempt orders issued by the judiciary, they are legally required to. And I worked with the U.S. Marshal Service for decades. Not only do they always get their man or woman, they always follow the law and enforce court orders. But here is where the challenge comes in. The U.S. Marshal Service is not part of the judiciary. They're not part of that branch of government, the judicial branch. They're part of the executive branch. They're in the Department of Justice under the control, ultimately, of Donald Trump. So what if Trump and his newly minted U.S. director of the U.S. Marshal Service, who hasn't been confirmed yet, says, no. Our marshals are not going to execute those court orders. My money's on the marshals because they follow the law. They always have, and I believe they always will. And so if you ask me how it should play out, if everyone is doing their jobs and following their oath of office and not being loyal to a corrupt president, then the U.S. Marshals should execute contempt orders that are issued against the Trump administration.
And we will continue with part 2 of our conversation with Glenn Kirschner in our next episode. The Nova Society is a production of Nova Society Media, a division of the Phoenix Research Institute. We'd like to thank our production partners, Buzzsprout, who hosts the Nova Society, Audacity, our editing partners, Apple iTunes, the largest source of podcasts and music on the internet, Spotify, the most popular platform for the Nova Society, and iHeartRadio, your source for all things music and podcasting. The Nova Society is available on all of these and other quality platforms listed in our description. We'd also like to thank all of our listeners. Without your support, the Nova Society would not be possible. If you have a question or a comment, we can be reached at nova.society.podcast@gmail.com. So for Dr. Brooklyn Ann Weldon, Dr. Priscilla Hobbs, Dr. Scott Gershwer, and all of us here at the Nova Society, I'm Dr. Mark Bound. Remember, the true power in society is knowledge. Thanks for listening, and we will see you again next time.
Hi, everyone. This is JJ, the co-founder of Good Pods. If you haven't heard of it yet, Good Pods is like Goodreads or Instagram, but for podcasts. It's new, it's social, it's different, and it's growing really fast. There are more than 2 million podcasts, and we know that it is impossible to figure out what to listen to. On Good Pods, you follow your friends and podcasters to see what they like. That is the #1 way to discover new shows and episodes. You can find Good Pods on the web or download the app. Happy listening!